Hi guys, imagine a scenario where the fate of the entire free world rests on the shoulders of a man who isn't even breathing, a homeless drifter transformed into a fake officer to fool the most paranoid dictator in history. This isn't the plot of a fictional spy thriller, but the absolute reality of World War II's most audacious deception, where a corpse was weaponized to save thousands of Allied lives and crack Hitler's fortress Europe wide open. We are diving deep into Operation Mincemeat, the plan so crazy it actually worked. Before we get started, if you enjoy exploring hidden corners of history at a slower pace, make sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and let me know in the comments where in the world you're tuning in from. I'd love to connect with you there. To understand how we got to a dead body in a wetsuit, we have to rewind to the smoke-filled war rooms of London in early 1943, where the mood was a mix of triumph and terrifying anxiety because the Allies had finally pushed the Axis forces out of North Africa, clearing the southern shores of the Mediterranean. But this victory presented a massive new problem that Prime Minister Winston Churchill famously described as the soft underbelly of Europe, creating a strategic dilemma that kept generals awake at night. The Americans and the British knew that to win the war they had to invade the European continent, and looking at a map, the next step was blatantly obvious to everyone, including the Germans, because the target was Sicily, the football being kicked by the boot of Italy, a massive island that controlled the shipping lanes and served as the perfect launchpad for an invasion of Italy itself. But the strategic obviousness of Sicily was a nightmare for Allied planners, because if you know where the enemy's coming, you can turn that landing zone into a meat grinder. The Germans were already pouring concrete, setting up machine gun nests, and moving panzer divisions to the island, preparing to throw the Allies back into the sea in a repetition of tragic failures like Gallipoli, or the more recent disaster at Dieppe. And the Allied commanders estimated that a direct assault on a fortified Sicily would result in tens of thousands of casualties, a bloodbath that could stall the war effort for years. So the British intelligence agencies, specifically the clandestine groups operating under the radar, were tasked with a mission that seemed impossible. They had to convince the German High Command that the Allies were going to attack anywhere but Sicily. This was the golden age of espionage, where the 20 Committee, a group named because the Roman numeral for 20 is XX, double cross, oversaw the double agent system. But for this specific problem, a double agent wasn't enough because the Germans were becoming suspicious of human spies who could be turned or tortured, so they needed documents, tangible proof of an invasion plan targeting Greece or Sardinia instead of Sicily. But they couldn't just drop a briefcase out of a plane because the Germans would suspect a plant, meaning the information had to be found on a messenger who had clearly died in an accident, someone who looked like they were carrying high-level secrets and had met a tragic end at sea. The seed of this idea actually came from a memo written years earlier, often attributed to Ian Fleming, the creator of James Bond, who was working in naval intelligence at the time. And in this trout memo, he compared deceiving the enemy to fly fishing, suggesting 54 different ways to lure the Nazi leadership. And item number 28 was titled, "A Suggestion, Not a Very Nice One," proposing that a corpse dressed as an airman with false papers be dropped where the Germans would find it. In 1943, this macabre idea was dusted off by two men who would become the architects of this deception. Ewan Montague, a brilliant, sharp-witted King's Counsel and naval intelligence officer who thrived on the intricate puzzle of counter-espionage, and Charles Cholmondeley, an eccentric, tall, gangly RAF flight lieutenant with a wild imagination and a penchant for thinking outside the box. These two men, working in a small, cramped basement room beneath the Admiralty building, a room that smelled of stale tobacco and nervous energy, began to refine Fleming's rough concept into a fully fledged operational plan, realizing that for the Germans to swallow the bait, the body couldn't just be any corpse. It had to be a specific kind of body, one that looked like it had died at sea from a plane crash, and it had to carry a pocket full of wallet litter, the personal items that prove a man is real, along with the fake invasion plans. They faced massive bureaucratic hurdles, moral questions about using the dead, and the sheer technical difficulty of finding a suitable body that wouldn't look suspicious during an autopsy. setting the stage for a race against time to create a fake person so convincing that he could lie to Hitler from beyond the grave. The search for the perfect corpse became a gruesome scavenger hunt through the morgues of London. A task that seems morbidly ironic given that the Blitz had provided the city with no shortage of casualties. But Montagu and Cholmondeley faced a very specific medical requirement, because to fool a German pathologist, the body had to look exactly like someone who had died of hypothermia and drowning after an airplane crash at sea, meaning there could be no bullet holes, no shrapnel wounds, and no crushed limbs, which ruled out almost every victim of the bombing raids. They needed a man who had died of natural causes that could mimic drowning, specifically with fluid in the lungs, and they needed him to be of military age, neither too old nor too scrawny, essentially a blank canvas upon which they could paint their masterpiece of deception. They enlisted the help of Sir Bentley Purchase, the coroner of the St. Pancras district, a man of dry wit and practical patriotism, who understood that bending the rules of the coroner's court was a small price to pay for saving thousands of lives, and he eventually called them with the news that he had found a candidate, a 34-year-old Welsh drifter named Glyndwr Michael. Michael was a tragic figure, a homeless labourer who had drifted to London to escape the poverty of the Welsh valleys, a man so forgotten by society that he had seemingly existed as a ghost even before he died, and his death was the result of desperation, having eaten bread smeared with rat poison that contained phosphorus, a substance that causes the liver to fail and the lungs to fill with fluid, creating a physiological condition that, to a pathologist not specifically looking for poison, would look remarkably like the effects of drifting in the cold ocean for days. With the body secured and kept on ice, literally frozen to preserve it while the plan was finalised, the intelligence officers began the process of transforming this poor, destitute soul into a hero of the British Empire, deciding to give him the rank of captain, acting major, in the Royal Marines. A specific choice made because Royal Marines wore battle dress rather than tailored uniforms, which meant the clothes didn't have to fit perfectly, hiding the fact that Glyndwr Michael was slightly frail from malnutrition. They christened him William Martin, a name chosen for being common enough to be plausible, but not so unique that it would trigger a specific investigation into his family tree by German agents in the UK, and thus began the strangest creative writing project of the war, where Montagu and his team had to invent an entire life for a man who didn't exist. They knew that the Germans were thorough, obsessive even, and that if the body was washed ashore, the Abwehr, German military intelligence, would empty his pockets and analyse every scrap of paper, so the wallet litter had to be perfect, painting a picture of a real human being with flaws, loves, and financial worries. They decided that Major Martin shouldn't be a stiff, perfect officer, but rather a bit of a playboy, a man who was good at his job but perhaps a little careless with his personal life, the kind of guy who would carry top-secret documents in a briefcase while thinking about his girlfriend. To cement this image, they created a fiancée named Pam, a fictional girl waiting back in London, and Montagu even asked a secretary at MI5, Jean Leslie, for a photograph of herself in a bathing suit to place in the dead man's wallet, inscribed with a loving note, adding a layer of heartbreaking realism that would make any soldier who found the body pause with sympathy. They forged love letters to Major Martin from Pam, writing them with a mix of affection and nagging about the wedding preparations, and they even went so far as to carry the letters around in their own pockets for days, folding and unfolding them, rubbing them against fabric to simulate the wear and tear of a man who read his sweetheart's words over and over again. They added a receipt for a diamond engagement ring, a bill for a stay at a flashy London club to show he had been celebrating his departure, and an angry letter from a bank manager about an overdraft of nearly £80, a brilliant touch because it established that Martin was irresponsible with money, exactly the kind of relatable flaw that makes a cover story undeniable. They also included ticket stubs from a theatre show in London dated just days before his departure, confirming his timeline and location, effectively building a three-dimensional character out of paper scraps, creating a man so real that even his creators started to feel like they knew him. all while the body of Glyndwr Michael lay freezing in a morgue, waiting for his final mission to begin. With the persona of Major William Martin fully fleshed out, the team turned their attention to the cork inside the bottle. The actual disinformation that would mislead the German High Command, because a wallet full of love letters would establish identity, but it wouldn't move panzer divisions. The centrepiece of the deception was a personal letter, a stroke of genius devised to bypass the scepticism of German intelligence officers who would spot a formal operational order as a fake immediately. So instead of official blueprints or typed orders, they decided on a handwritten, chatty, off-the-record letter from Lieutenant General Sir Archibald Nye, the Vice Chief of the Imperial General Staff, to General Sir Harold Alexander, the commander of the Anglo-American 18th Army Group in North Africa. This letter was a masterpiece of subtlety, written on official War Office stationery, in which Nye casually discussed Operation Husky, the code name for the invasion of Sicily, but referred to it as a deception plan to cover the real invasions of Greece and Sardinia, effectively flipping the reality on its head by telling the Germans that the massive build-up they saw was aimed at Greece, and that Sicily was just a feint to distract them. To make it absolutely bulletproof, they included a second letter from Lord Louis Mountbatten, the Chief of Combined Operations, to Admiral Cunningham in the Mediterranean, introducing Major Martin as an expert in amphibious warfare who was being loaned to the theatre, a detail that explained why a Royal Marine was carrying such sensitive documents and why he was flying rather than taking a slower transport. Montague was so paranoid about whether the Germans would actually open the letter or just return it unread that he placed a single human eyelash deep within the fold of the paper, reasoning that if the letter was intercepted and opened, the eyelash would fall out and be lost, serving as a microscopic tamper-evident seal that would let British intelligence know if the bait had been taken. Now came the logistical nightmare of transporting a decomposing corpse from a London basement to the coast of Spain, without raising the alarm or letting the body thaw out, which required the construction of a specialised airtight steel canister designed by the National Physical Laboratory, a double-shelled container packed with dry ice that looked suspiciously like a high-explosive bomb or a chemical weapon, adding another layer of tension to the operation. The transportation phase began under a cloak of heavy secrecy on April 17th, 1943, when Montague and Cholmondeley loaded the canister into a van driven by St. John Jock Horsfall, a famous pre-war racing car driver who had been recruited by MI5 for his ability to drive at breakneck speeds through the blackout-darkened roads of wartime Britain. The trio raced north from London to the Holy Loch submarine base in Scotland, a tense, bumpy journey where they were essentially smuggling a dead man through their own country, praying that a traffic accident or a curious policeman wouldn't expose the entire scheme before it even started. Upon arriving in Scotland, they met the vessel chosen for this macabre delivery, the HMS Seraph, a submarine commanded by Lieutenant Bill Jewell, a young but battle-hardened officer who had already participated in secret missions, including smuggling an American general out of North Africa. Jewell was the only one on board, aside from a few select officers, who knew what was actually inside the steel canister, while the rest of the crew was told it contained a top-secret meteorological device, an optical instrument that required careful handling, a line necessary to prevent the superstitious sailors from panicking about having a dead body on board, often considered a massive bad omen at sea. As the heavy canister was lowered into the torpedo room of the Seraph, the operation transitioned from a desk-bound plot to a live tactical mission, with the submarine slipping out of the harbour and submerging into the cold Atlantic, setting a course for the coast of Spain, carrying a passenger who would never wake up but was about to change the course of history. The voyage of the HMS Seraph was a gruelling 10-day endurance test of nerves and claustrophobia as the submarine navigated the treacherous waters of the Bay of Biscay, dodging German U-boats and enemy patrols while carrying its silent frozen passenger in the torpedo room. For the crew, who were still largely in the dark about the true nature of the optical instrument in the canister, the atmosphere was thick with tension, but for Lieutenant Jewell, the pressure was agonizing because he knew that the timing of the drop had to be scientifically perfect to catch the tides correctly. ensuring the body would wash ashore rather than drifting out into the vast emptiness of the Atlantic. The destination was the coast of Huelva in southwestern Spain, a location chosen with surgical precision by British intelligence, not because it was a combat zone, but because it was a hotbed of intrigue where the line between friend and foe was blurred. While Spain was officially neutral, the Franco regime was sympathetic to Hitler, and Huelva specifically was the operating ground of a hyperactive German vice-consul named Adolf Klaus, a man known for his efficiency and his deep connections with the local Spanish authorities, making him the perfect target to intercept the lost documents. The plan relied entirely on the Spanish police finding the body and handing the effects over to the Germans, or at least allowing the Germans to copy them, before returning them to the British vice-consul, a delicate bank shot of espionage where the British had to trust their enemies to do exactly what they were expected to do. On the morning of April 30th, 1943, under the cover of a moonless pre-dawn darkness, the Seraph surfaced off the Spanish coast, the fresh, salty air rushing into the stale atmosphere of the sub as Joule ordered the canister to be brought up to the casing. The crew struggled with the heavy steel container, hauling it onto the slippery deck where the officers finally cracked the seal, revealing the body of Glyndwr Michael, now Major William Martin, who was beginning to thaw but was still in good condition for the ruse. There was a solemn, almost spiritual quiet on the deck as they prepared the body for its final journey. They inflated his May West life jacket, checking that he looked like a man who had hurriedly donned his safety gear before a crash, and then came the most critical detail, the black attaché case containing the invasion plans. To ensure the briefcase remained with the body through the rough surf, they chained it to the trenchcoat belt of the Major, a slight deviation from standard military procedure, since officers didn't typically chain cases to themselves. But Montagu had reasoned that the Germans would interpret this as a sign of the extreme importance of the documents, a visual cue screaming top secret. Before pushing him into the dark water, Lieutenant Joule, in a moment of profound humanity amidst the calculated coldness of war, gathered his officers and recited the 39th Psalm, reading the words, "I said, I will take heed to my ways, that I sin not with my tongue," effectively conducting a burial at sea for the Welsh drifter who had died alone and unmourned, giving him the military send-off he never had in life. With the prayer finished, they gently slid the body into the sea, the wash from the submarine's propellers catching the corpse and pushing it toward the distant sleeping coastline of Spain, and to complete the tableau of a tragedy, they launched a rubber dinghy nearby, overturning it to simulate the wreckage of a downed aircraft. As the Seraph turned away and dove back into the safety of the deep, leaving Major Martin bobbing alone in the swells of the Atlantic, Joule sent a coded signal back to the Admiralty in London. Mincemeat completed, a message that signalled the end of the physical mission and the beginning of the psychological one, shifting the burden of the operation from the sailors to the spies, who now had to sit by their radios and wait to see if the Nazis would take the bait. The morning sun broke over the glittering Atlantic on April 30th, warming the cold waves that cradled the drifting form of the Major, and around 9:30 a.m., about a mile off the sandy beach of La Bota, a solitary sardine fisherman named José Antonio Rey Maria spotted what looked like a strange dark bundle bobbing in the water. Thinking it might be wreckage or valuable salvage, he steered his small boat closer, only to recoil in horror when he realised he was looking at the uniformed corpse of a British officer, floating face down, the life jacket keeping him buoyant in a grotesque parody of a swimmer. He hauled the sodden, heavy body into his boat, a task that required immense physical effort, and must have been terrifying for a superstitious fisherman alone on the ocean, and immediately set a course for the nearest port, his catch of the day suddenly transformed into an international incident. When he reached the shore, the local Spanish authorities took custody of the body, and the machinery of bureaucracy began to grind into gear, a process that Montagu and his team back in London were counting on to be leaky and corrupt. The body was carried on a donkey to a nearby hut, and then transferred to the relentless heat of the Huelva cemetery, where the humid Spanish air began to accelerate the decomposition process, adding a ticking clock to the entire operation, because if the body rotted too much, the game would be up. Enter Francis Hazelden, the British vice-consul in Welver, a man who had been briefed by London and was now playing the role of his life, acting as a distressed but efficient diplomat who wanted to bury his fallen countrymen with dignity, while frantically, but not too frantically, trying to recover the briefcase. Hazelden's performance was critical because if he seemed too desperate to get the documents back, the Germans, who had spies embedded everywhere in Welver, including the Port Authority and the police, would smell a rat. But if he didn't seem to care enough, they might just hand the briefcase over without opening it, so he had to strike a perfect balance of bureaucratic anxiety, demanding the return of the briefcase for proper military channels, while knowing full well that his protests were merely whetting the appetite of the Nazi agents watching from the shadows. The most dangerous moment of the entire operation arrived the next day during the autopsy, performed by a local Spanish naval doctor, Eduardo del Torno, in a sweltering room filled with the overpowering stench of death, where Hazelden stood by, holding his breath in both the literal and metaphorical sense, terrified that the doctor would open the lungs and find not seawater, but the telltale signs of chemical poison, or notice that the body was far more decomposed than a man who'd been in the water for only a few days should be. Fortune favoured the bold, or perhaps the lazy, because the Spanish doctor, overwhelmed by the smell and the heat, and seeing the clear external evidence of a uniform and a life jacket, decided to cut corners. He made a cursory examination, noted the apparent cause of death as asphyxiation by immersion, effectively ruling it a drowning, and didn't bother with the microscopic analysis that would have unravelled the entire plot. He handed Hazelden the death certificate, a piece of paper that was worth more than gold to the British intelligence team, confirming that the first hurdle had been cleared, but the real prize, the black attaché case, remained in the custody of the Spanish Navy, locked away in a safe, becoming the singular object of desire for the German spy network. The German vice-consul, Adolf Klaus, a man so active in espionage that the British had once considered kidnapping him, was already buzzing around the Spanish authorities like a fly, using every ounce of leverage, bribery and diplomatic pressure he could muster to get a look inside that briefcase, convinced by the secret classification and the chain attached to the officer's belt that he was on the verge of the intelligence coup of the century. While Major Martin was laid to rest in the Welver cemetery with full military honours, including a wreath sent by his fiancée Pam, a touch of black humour from London, the briefcase sat in the dark, a silent time bomb waiting to go off, as the Spanish officials, caught between the pressure of the British demanding their property and the Germans demanding a peek, dithered and delayed, unwittingly building the suspense that would make the deception even more convincing when the seal was finally broken. The black attaché case had now become the most radioactive object in Spain, a leather-bound Pandora's box that everyone wanted but no one dared to openly claim, kicking off a high-stakes diplomatic poker game between London, Madrid and Berlin. While the physical body of Major Martin lay decomposing in the grave, the British intensified the psychological warfare by sending a flurry of panic signals, encrypted messages between London and the naval attaché in Madrid that they knew the Germans were intercepting and decoding. These messages were a masterclass in reverse psychology, with the British frantically asking about the missing documents, stressing that it was vital they be recovered unopened, and even discussing the possibility of demanding the Spanish exhume the body to retrieve them, a level of desperation that convinced the listening Germans that whatever was inside that case was the holy grail of Allied secrets. The German intelligence machine, led in Spain by the ambitious and easily duped Karl Erich Kuhlenthal, the head of the Abwehr in Madrid, began to apply crushing pressure on the Spanish government, essentially calling in every favour and using every bribe they had to get a look at the contents. The Spanish, caught in the middle and terrified of offending the likely victors of the war, while still owing a debt to Hitler, finally caved, and the briefcase was quietly transported from the coast to the General Staff headquarters in Madrid. Here, in a secure backroom, a team of Spanish Secret Service agents sympathetic to the Nazi cause performed a delicate surgical operation on the damp envelopes, a task that required the steady hands of a bomb disposal expert, because the British seals were still intact. The letters inside were wet, swollen with seawater, and fragile as tissue paper, meaning that one wrong move would tear the documents and reveal the tampering. So the Spanish technicians painstakingly dried the envelopes, using a long, thin probe to wind the letters tightly around a rod and extract them through the unsealed gap at the top of the flap without ever breaking the wax seals, a technique known as rolling. Once the letters were extracted, the room must have gone silent as the Spanish officers and their German liaisons read the handwriting of General Nye, their eyes widening as they processed the bombshell information that the Allies were targeting Greece and Sardinia, not Sicily. The camera shutters clicked furiously, photographing every page, every receipt, and even the photo of Pam in her swimsuit, creating a dossier of deception that was immediately rushed to the German embassy. The tension in that room was palpable, a mix of exhilaration and fear, because they believed they were holding the key to the entire war, unaware that they were actually documenting their own doom. After the photos were developed, the letters were carefully re-rolled and inserted back into the envelopes. The flaps were re-glued with a precision that made them look untouched, and the briefcase was locked again, restoring its innocent appearance. However, in their haste and excitement, the Spanish technicians failed to notice the microscopic sentinels Montague had left behind. The single eyelash tucked into the fold of the letter was lost, displaced during the extraction, a tiny detail that would eventually confirm to the British that the seals had indeed been breached. The briefcase was then officially handed over to the British ambassador, Sir Samuel Hoare, with a straight-faced assurance from the Spanish authorities that nothing had been touched, a lie that the British accepted with a polite nod, even as they rushed the returned documents back to London for forensic analysis to see if the trap had snapped shut. Meanwhile, the photographs of the documents were already on a plane headed for Berlin, carried by a courier who believed he was delivering the death warrant of the Allied invasion force, but was actually delivering the virus that would infect the German High Command with a fatal strategic error. Back in the subterranean fortress of the Admiralty in London, the return of the briefcase was the moment Ewan Montague and Charles Cholmondeley had been sweating over for weeks, the final exam where the grading curve was life or death. When the diplomatic bag arrived from Spain, they treated the black attaché case like a bomb that had already exploded, handling it with the reverence of archaeologists unearthing a cursed artifact. They took the letters to the laboratory, their hearts pounding against their ribs, and performed the forensic checks they had prepared for, starting with the simple, low-tech eyelash test. They gently unfolded the letter from General Nye, and there it was. Or rather, there it wasn't. The eyelash was gone, vanished into the ether of a Spanish Secret Service office, the first concrete proof that the letter had been extracted and read. Further microscopic analysis revealed that the fibres of the paper had been stressed in a way consistent with being rolled tightly around a thin probe, and forensic chemical tests showed that the seals had been reforged, likely with a mix of fresh wax and the original fragments, a job done with high skill but not enough to fool the creators of the deception. The confirmation was absolute when the ultra-secret government codebreakers at Bletchley Park, the geniuses who had cracked the German Enigma code, intercepted a message from Madrid to Berlin that sent a jolt of electricity through the British command. The Abwehr was transmitting the detailed contents of the Martin documents to the High Command, treating the intelligence as a Priority 1 discovery. In Madrid, Karl Erich Kuhlenthal, the head of the Abwehr station, had fallen for the ruse so completely that he staked his entire professional reputation on the authenticity of the find, ignoring the too-good-to-be-true nature of the discovery, because it confirmed what the Germans already desperately wanted to believe, that the Allies were bypassing the obvious target of Sicily. He packaged the intelligence with his personal seal of approval, forwarding it to the one man in Berlin who had the power to validate or destroy the entire operation, Colonel Alexis von Rhone, the head of Fremde Heere West, Foreign Armies West, Hitler's favourite intelligence analyst. Von Rhone was a complex, enigmatic figure, a brilliant aristocrat who privately despised the Nazis and would eventually be executed for his role in the plot to kill Hitler, leading some historians to speculate that he might have suspected the fraud, but let it pass to sabotage the war effort, while others believe he simply made a professional error, blinded by the sheer detail of the wallet litter. Regardless of his motivation, von Renner did exactly what the British needed him to do. He studied the documents, the love letters, the overdraft, and the casual mention of Greece, and he issued a report that would become the gospel of the German army, stating unequivocally that the documents were genuine and the intelligence was reliable. This stamp of approval was the turbocharger the lie needed, propelling it from a curious rumour to a strategic fact that landed directly on the desk of Adolf Hitler at the Wolf's Lair. Back in London, when the news came through that the Germans had accepted the story, a telegram was sent to Winston Churchill, who was in Washington, D.C. at the time, containing a phrase that has since become legendary in the annals of espionage: "Mincemeat swallowed rod, line, and sinker." The metaphor of the trout fishing had come full circle. The British had cast their line into the dark waters of the Atlantic, baited with a dead man, and the biggest fish of all, the Nazi war machine, had bitten down hard, unaware that the hook was already embedded deep in its jaw, ready to drag it toward a disastrous defeat in the Mediterranean. The impact of the deception on Hitler was instantaneous and dramatic, triggering a massive, chaotic reshuffling of Axis forces that would have been comical if the stakes weren't so deadly. Hitler, a man whose military intuition had once been his greatest asset but was now degenerating into paranoia, seized upon the Martin documents as the final puzzle piece that explained everything, validating his long-held fear that the Balkans were the vulnerable underbelly of his empire. He immediately issued orders that turned the German strategic map upside down, overruling his own generals in Italy, including the formidable Benito Mussolini, who had correctly guessed that Sicily was the real target simply by looking at a map and realizing it was a stepping stone to his own country. Hitler, convinced by the indisputable evidence from the dead major, declared that the apparent build-up against Sicily was a sophisticated feint designed to pin down his forces, while the real blow fell on Greece and Sardinia. The order went out to move entire divisions, a logistical undertaking of colossal proportions that saw thousands of troops, tanks and artillery pieces pulled away from the actual invasion beaches of Sicily and sent on wild goose chases across Europe. The 1st Panzer Division, a crack unit of battle-hardened veterans, was ordered to trek all the way from France to Greece, a journey of nearly 1,000 miles that wasted precious fuel and wore out the tracks of their tanks on mountain roads, positioning them perfectly to defend against an invasion that would never come. In the Mediterranean, the German Navy began laying massive minefields off the coast of Greece, diverting their mine layers from the Sicilian Straits, effectively leaving the front door of the real invasion zone unlocked while they barricaded the window. Furthermore, a flotilla of R-boats, critical for coastal defence, was transferred from Sicily to the Aegean Sea, stripping the Italian defenders of their naval support just when they would need it most. Perhaps the most significant movement was the transfer of Marshal Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox, the most feared German commander of the war, who was sent to Athens to command the defence of Greece, a move that signalled to the entire German army that the centre of gravity had shifted east. The deception was so effective that it even infected the German High Command's interpretation of real intelligence. When Allied commando raids hit targets in Sicily to test defences, the Germans dismissed them as diversionary tactics, further proof that the real attack was happening elsewhere. It was a masterclass in confirmation bias, where every piece of evidence was twisted to fit the narrative established by Major Martin's briefcase, creating a self-reinforcing delusion that blinded the Nazis to the armada of ships gathering in North Africa. While the Germans were busy digging trenches on the beaches of Kalamata and reinforcing the garrisons in Sardinia, the Allies were finalising the loading of the invasion fleet for Operation Husky, watching with disbelief and glee as the enemy voluntarily weakened their defences at the exact point of impact. The dead homeless man from Wales was now commanding more German troops than most living German generals, effectively neutralising nearly 20 divisions without firing a single shot, creating a strategic vacuum in Sicily that would save countless young Americans, British and Canadians from being slaughtered on the sands of Gela and Syracuse. On the night of July 9th, 1943, the payoff of Operation Mincemeat arrived on the crest of a violent storm, a gale-force wind that whipped the Mediterranean into a frenzy and threatened to cancel the entire invasion of Sicily before the first boot even touched the sand. The weather was so atrocious that the Italian defenders on the island relaxed their guard, convinced that no sane commander would attempt an amphibious landing in such choppy seas, unknowingly playing right into the hands of the Allies who used the cover of the storm to mask the approach of the largest armada the world had ever seen up to that point. Nearly 3,000 ships carrying 160,000 men, a force even larger than the initial wave that would land at Normandy a year later. As the sun rose on July 10th, the storm miraculously broke, leaving behind a churning surf through which the landing craft of General George Patton's 7th Army and General Bernard Montgomery's 8th Army charged toward the beaches, expecting a wall of fire and steel, but instead finding a coastline that was surprisingly porous. The deception plan had worked so thoroughly that even as Allied paratroopers were dropping from the sky and tanks were rolling onto the Sicilian shores, the German High Command in Berlin was paralysed by indecision, trapped in a state of cognitive dissonance where they refused to believe the evidence of their own eyes because it contradicted the intelligence from Major Martin's briefcase. For the first critical 48 hours, the golden window of time where an amphibious invasion is most vulnerable to being pushed back into the sea, the German response was sluggish and confused. Local commanders were screaming for reinforcements, but the strategic reserves held back by Hitler remained frozen in place, or, worse, continued to guard the empty beaches of Greece and Sardinia, waiting for the real invasion that the dead man had promised was coming. Hitler himself, sitting in his bunker thousands of miles away, dismissed the initial reports of the Sicilian landings as a large-scale feint, a diversionary tactic designed to draw his forces away from the Balkans, and he stubbornly refused to release the powerful panzer divisions that could have crushed the Allied beachhead in its infancy. It wasn't until weeks later, when the Allies had firmly established their foothold and were pushing inland, capturing key airfields and ports, that the horrifying realization finally dawned on the Nazi leadership. There was no invasion of Greece coming. The Martin documents were a fabrication, and they had been completely, utterly played. The cost of this realization for the Germans was catastrophic. The troops sent to Greece were stuck there, unable to return in time to save Sicily, effectively taking tens of thousands of the Wehrmacht's best soldiers off the chessboard during the most critical battle of the Mediterranean campaign. For the Allies, the success of Operation Mincemeat was measured not just in territory gained, but in lives saved. The planners had estimated up to 10,000 casualties in the first week alone, but the actual number was a fraction of that, with the British losing only about 1,500 men and the Americans suffering relatively light losses compared to the slaughter they had anticipated. The beaches of Sicily, which should have been soaked in blood, were secured with a speed that shocked even the Allied commanders, turning what was expected to be a gruelling months-long slog into a 38-day campaign that knocked Italy out of the war and opened the road to Rome. The ghost of Glyndwr Michael, the Welsh drifter who had never held a gun in his life, had effectively won the first major battle of the liberation of Europe, proving that in modern warfare, a well-placed lie can be more lethal than 1,000 bombs, leaving the Allies to celebrate a victory that belonged as much to the spies in the basement of the Admiralty as it did to the soldiers on the ground. The genius of Operation Mincemeat lay not just in the initial invasion, but in the lingering ghost of the deception that continued to haunt the German decision-making process long after the battle for Sicily had begun, creating a strategic paralysis that is almost unique in the history of warfare. Even as General Patton's tanks were tearing through the Sicilian countryside, and the British were hammering away at the defences near Mount Etna, Adolf Hitler remained fixated on the phantom threat to Greece, paralysed by the conviction that the fighting in Sicily was merely a diversionary attack designed to lure his reserves away from the Balkans. This stubborn refusal to accept reality meant that for 2 critical weeks, the German panzer divisions sitting idly in Greece, troops that could have tipped the balance in Sicily, or at least made the Allied advance infinitely more bloody, were kept watching the empty horizon of the Aegean Sea, waiting for an armada that existed only in the pages of a dead man's love letters. The ripple effects of this hesitation were tectonic, extending far beyond the Mediterranean theatre and reaching all the way to the Eastern Front, where the largest tank battle in history, the Battle of Kursk, was raging between the Wehrmacht and the Red Army. Hitler, panicked by the collapsing situation in Italy and the sudden realization that his soft underbelly was being ripped open, made the impulsive decision to cancel Operation Citadel, the German offensive at Kursk, in order to divert elite SS panzer divisions to Italy to plug the gap. This was a turning point of the war in the East. It was the first time Hitler had ever aborted a major strategic offensive before a breakthrough could be achieved, essentially handing the strategic initiative to the Soviet Union, who would never relinquish it until they raised their flag over the Reichstag in Berlin. So, in a very real sense, the homeless man from Wales didn't just save lives in Sicily. He helped save the Soviet Union from a potentially devastating blow, linking the fate of a drowned drifter to the survival of the Eastern Front. Back in Rome, the impact of the invasion was political dynamite. The swift fall of Sicily, which the fascist propaganda machine had promised was an impregnable fortress, shattered the remaining credibility of Benito Mussolini. On July 25, 1943, just 2 weeks after the landings, the Grand Council of Fascism met in a tense, sweaty session and voted to remove Il Duce from power, leading to his arrest by the King of Italy the following day, a collapse of a dictatorship that had lasted 20 years, triggered by the domino effect started by a single briefcase. The German High Command, now scrambling to occupy Italy and disarm their former allies, was forced to pour even more resources into the Mediterranean, essentially fulfilling the Allies' grand strategic goal of stretching the German army until it snapped. Amidst this chaos, the Martin documents were quietly buried in the archives of the Abwehr, the embarrassment too great to be openly discussed. There was no moment where a German general slammed his fist on the table and shouted, "We've been tricked," but rather a slow, sinking realization that they had been outplayed, a silence that spoke volumes. The British, monitoring the German radio traffic, watched with grim satisfaction as the confusion unfolded, knowing that they had achieved the holy grail of intelligence operations. They had not only deceived the enemy about where the attack would come, but they had forced the enemy to defeat himself through misplaced resources. As the dust settled over Sicily and the Allies prepared for the jump to the Italian mainland, the body of Major William Martin lay undisturbed in the Huelva cemetery, his mission officially complete, but the story of his afterlife was only just beginning, as the secrecy surrounding his true identity would lock him in a state of anonymous heroism for decades, leaving the world to wonder who the man really was that had fooled the Führer and broken the back of the Axis in the south. The success of the invasion of Sicily brought a wave of euphoria to the Allied command, but inside the cramped, smoke-filled Room 13 of the Admiralty, Ewan Montagu and Charles Cholmondeley couldn't pop the champagne just yet because they were grappling with a new, complex problem, the preservation of the lie. They realised that if the Germans discovered they had been tricked by a corpse, the credibility of British intelligence would be shattered, and crucially, any future deception plans for the ultimate invasion of France, Operation Overlord, would be scrutinised with paranoid suspicion by the Nazis. To protect the secrets of D-Day, Major William Martin had to remain a real person in the eyes of the enemy, meaning the deception had to continue long after the body was in the ground. This led to one of the most morally ambiguous decisions of the entire operation, where Montagu had to insert the fictional name of William Martin into the official British casualty list published in the Times of London, a sacred roll call of the fallen that was read by grieving families across the nation. On June 4th, 1943, under the heading Killed on Active Service, the name Martin W. Captor RM appeared alongside the names of flesh and blood soldiers who had died fighting the Axis, a necessary sacrilege that weighed heavily on Montagu's conscience, but was essential because German intelligence monitored these lists obsessively to cross-reference their data. To further cement the illusion, the Admiralty arranged for a permanent headstone to be placed over the grave in the Welver cemetery, replacing the simple wooden cross with a marble slab paid for by the grieving father of the Major. In a stroke of dark classical irony, Montagu chose the Latin epitaph Dulce et decorum est pro patria mori. It is sweet and fitting to die for one's country, a phrase from the Roman poet Horace that is often used to glorify military sacrifice, carved above the remains of a homeless man who had died from swallowing rat poison in a London warehouse. This commitment to the bit paid off when reports trickled back to London that German agents in Spain were actually visiting the grave, checking to see if it was being tended to, and finding the fresh flowers and the permanent stone. They reported back to Berlin that the British were treating the site with the reverence due to a high-ranking officer, inadvertently confirming the authenticity of the deception all over again. The Germans were so thoroughly hoodwinked that they never launched a serious investigation into how the documents were obtained, and the specific officers who had endorsed the intelligence, like Karl Erich Kuhlenthal in Madrid, were now trapped in a conspiracy of silence. To admit that the documents might have been fake would be to admit to a blunder of treasonous proportions, so they doubled down on the lie to save their own skins. This created a bizarre feedback loop where the German intelligence service, the Abwehr, became the unwitting protectors of the mincemeat secret, suppressing any doubts that arose in the lower ranks to avoid the wrath of Hitler. Meanwhile, back in London, the fiancée Pam, played by the MI5 secretary Jean Leslie, had to continue her shadow life as well, avoiding certain social circles and maintaining the fiction among anyone who wasn't in the know, while Montagu kept the love letters and the photograph as strange souvenirs of the romance he had invented. The operation had been so successful that it effectively inoculated the Germans against the truth. Even when they captured authentic Allied documents in later campaigns, they treated them with deep suspicion, fearing another Martin trick, which meant that Operation Mincemeat didn't just mislead them once, it permanently broke their trust in their own intelligence-gathering capabilities. The ghost of the Welsh drifter was now casting a long shadow over the entire European theatre, acting as a silent guardian for the secrets of the impending invasion of Normandy, ensuring that when the real big one came, the Germans would be looking the wrong way again, paralysed by the fear of being fooled by the dead. As the smoke cleared over Europe and the world transitioned from the hot war against fascism to the Cold War, the file on Operation Mincemeat was locked away in the deepest recesses of the British archives, stamped top secret, and intended to remain buried for 100 years, because the intelligence services believed the technique of using a dead body might be needed again, and didn't want to show their hand to the Soviets. However, secrets have a way of leaking, and in 1950 the silence was broken not by a spy, but by a former cabinet minister, Duff Cooper, who wrote a spy novel titled Operation Heartbreak, the plot of which was so suspiciously similar to Mincemeat, featuring a dead body with false papers floating onto a foreign shore, that it sent the security services into a panic, convinced that Cooper had casually blown one of the war's greatest secrets under the guise of fiction. Ewan Montagu, now back to his civilian life as a lawyer but forever the guardian of Major Martin, realised that the story was going to come out whether the government liked it or not, so he decided that the best way to control the narrative was to tell it himself, asking for permission to write the official account of the operation. In 1953, he published The Man Who Never Was, a book that became an instant international bestseller, captivating the public imagination with the sheer audacity of the plot, and turning the dead Major into a folk hero of the 20th century, a literary sensation that was quickly adapted into a Hollywood blockbuster in 1956. However, even in this true account, Montagu perpetuated one final massive lie to protect the dignity of the operation and the British government, knowing that the truth, that they had used the body of a homeless man who died of rat-poisoned suicide without his family's consent, would be seen as gruesome and unethical. Montagu fabricated a heartwarming backstory for the body. He told the world that the corpse belonged to a young man who had died of pneumonia, and that they had obtained explicit patriotic permission from his grieving relatives to use his remains, a noble sacrifice narrative that made the public feel good about the deception and shielded the intelligence services from moral outrage. This sanitized version of history became the accepted truth for over 4 decades, meaning that while the world celebrated the character of Major Martin, the real human being, Glyndwr Michael, remained completely erased, his identity hidden behind a wall of official secrecy and Montagu's well-crafted fiction. It wasn't until 1996, more than 50 years after the body was dropped into the sea, that an amateur historian named Roger Morgan, digging through declassified files in the Public Record Office in London, stumbled upon a critical mistake in the redaction process. He found a document listing the identity of the body, a scrap of paper that had escaped the censor's black marker. The name Glyndwr Michael was finally brought into the light, revealing the tragic reality behind the spy legend and sparking a renewed global interest in the case, as historians and journalists rushed to piece together the fractured life of the man who had saved thousands. This discovery changed the entire tone of the Mincemeat legacy, shifting it from a clever boy's own adventure story into a complex meditation on ethics, identity, and the value of a single human life, forcing the British government to finally acknowledge the debt they owed to a man they had picked out of a morgue because he was nobody. The revelation was a bombshell that stripped away the glamour of the 1956 movie and exposed the raw, gritty desperation of 1943, proving that the greatest deception wasn't just fooling Hitler, but fooling the history books for half a century about who the hero actually was. The uncovering of Glyndwr Michael's name peeled back the layers of a heartbreaking social tragedy that stands in stark contrast to the glamorous world of spies and naval officers, revealing that the true hero of Operation Mincemeat was a man who had been systematically failed by the very society he ended up saving. Born in the harsh, coal-dusted town of Aberbargod in the Rhymney Valley of Wales, Glyndwr was the son of a coal miner, growing up in a world of crushing poverty and limited opportunity, a life that was further shattered when his father attempted suicide by cutting his own throat, surviving the wound only to die later of influenza, leaving a young Glyndwr to care for his mother until she too passed away. Left completely alone in the world, uneducated, unskilled, and likely suffering from undiagnosed mental health issues, he drifted away from the valleys, a ghost in the machine of pre-war Britain, eventually ending up in London, not as an adventurer seeking fortune, but as a destitute wanderer seeking a crust of bread. He lived in the shadows of the metropolis, sleeping in abandoned warehouses and under bridges, invisible to the crowds of people who walk past him every day, a stark reminder of the Great Depression's lingering toll. His death in January 1943 was as lonely and desperate as his life. He was found in an abandoned warehouse near King's Cross, writhing in agony from having ingested rat poison, a paste containing phosphorus that was commonly smeared on bread to kill vermin. To this day, historians debate whether he ate the poisoned bread out of sheer, blinding hunger, mistaking it for food in the dark, or if he took it intentionally to end his misery, a final act of agency in a life where he had none. But regardless of the intent, the result was a slow, agonizing death that destroyed his internal organs, but left his external body intact, inadvertently preserving him for the coroner's table. It is a profound and bitter irony that the British intelligence services, who were looking for a man who belonged to no one, found their perfect candidate in Glyndwr precisely because he was so utterly discarded. His malnutrition meant he had no surplus flesh, fitting the profile of a fit officer, and his lack of family meant no one would come looking for him, effectively turning his tragedy into a strategic asset. For decades, while generals wrote memoirs and politicians took credit for the victory in Europe, Glyndwr Michael lay in the Spanish soil under a false name, his sacrifice unacknowledged, his existence denied, a mere prop in a grand play. However, the revelation of his identity in the late 90s sparked a movement to restore his dignity, leading to a remarkable moment of restitution in 1998, when the Commonwealth War Graves Commission, the organisation responsible for honouring the war dead, officially recognised him. In a solemn ceremony at the cemetery in Huelva, attended by British diplomats and military representatives, the marble headstone was carefully removed and replaced with a new one that finally told the truth, bearing the inscription, Glyndwr Michael, served as Major William Martin, RM, inextricably linking the homeless drifter and the fictional officer forever. A postscript was added to the grave. He died for his country, a statement that carries a complex weight, because while he didn't choose to die for his country chose him to die for it, and in doing so, he achieved a level of impact that few humans in history ever reach. This belated recognition transformed the site in Huelva from a curiosity of espionage into a pilgrimage site for those who understand the true cost of war, reminding visitors that the unknown soldier is often just a man whose name we have forgotten to ask. The story of Glyndwr Michael forces us to confront the uncomfortable ethics of the operation. The utilitarian calculus that decided one dead homeless man was worth risking to save thousands of live soldiers, and while the morality remains debated, the efficacy of his service is undeniable, proving that even the most marginalised invisible person can cast a giant shadow over history if given the chance, even if that chance comes after their heart has stopped beating. While the physical body of Glyndwr Michael was the passive vessel of the operation, the heartbeat of the deception came from the strange, almost feverish relationship that developed between his creators, a dynamic that turned the planning of mincemeat into a bizarre psychological drama played out in the blackout darkened streets of London, blurring the lines between reality and fiction in a way that would make a psychiatrist dizzy. Ewan Montague, the mastermind behind the plan, found himself becoming dangerously attached to the characters he had invented, particularly the fictional fiancée Pam, whose persona was embodied by the young and vibrant MI5 clerk Jean Leslie. During the high-stress weeks of waiting for news from Spain, Montague, whose own wife and children had been evacuated to America to escape the Blitz, began to live out a shadow life as Major Martin, courting Jean Leslie as if he were the dead man, taking her to clubs and dinners where they would stay in character, ostensibly to test the cover story, but in reality seeking comfort in a fantasy world to escape the crushing pressures of the war. They wrote intimate letters to each other signed Bill and Pam, creating a feedback loop where the emotions in the fake love letters found in the briefcase were fueled by a genuine, albeit platonic flirtation between the intelligence officers, adding a layer of raw emotional authenticity to the documents that no amount of cold calculation could have forged. On the other side of the desk sat Charles Cholmondeley, the unsung architect of the scheme, a man who remains one of the most eccentric figures in British intelligence history. A giant of a man with a grandiose moustache and a mind that worked like a Rube Goldberg machine, he was the one who handled the gruesome logistics of the body, while Montague handled the glamour. Cholmondeley was a natural-born spy who would walk around London looking for German agents, sometimes carrying a sword cane or wearing strange disguises, and for him, Operation Mincemeat was the culmination of a life spent dreaming of the perfect trick. The toll of the operation on him was immense, and after the war, while Montague went on to fame and literary success, Cholmondeley largely faded into obscurity, a quiet hero who never sought the spotlight, content with the knowledge that his macabre idea had saved the invasion. The artifacts of their deception, the physical remnants of the lie, have since taken on a legendary status of their own. The original Trout memo, the black attaché case, and the survival kit are now preserved in the Imperial War Museum and the National Archives, treated with the same reverence as the crown jewels or the Magna Carta. Looking at these mundane objects today, a rusty key, a faded theatre ticket, a grainy photograph of a girl in a swimsuit, it is terrifying to realise how fragile the entire enterprise was, resting on the assumption that a German analyst would interpret a receipt for a diamond ring as a sign of love rather than a sign of a trap. The operation also left a lasting fingerprint on the world of fiction, specifically through the connection to Ian Fleming, who was Montague's assistant at the time and was deeply involved in the planning. Many historians argue that the intricate plotting, the flamboyant villains, and the gadgetry of the James Bond novels were directly inspired by the creative madness of the 20 Committee. In fact, the character of M, Bond's boss, is often said to be a composite of the various naval intelligence directors Fleming worked with, including the steely Admiral Godfrey who signed off on Mincemeat. Thus, the DNA of the dead homeless man is woven not just into the history of World War II, but into the pop culture fabric of the 20th century, influencing every spy movie and thriller that followed, proving that truth is not only stranger than fiction, but often the source of fiction. The legacy of the operation is a testament to the power of the human imagination, showing that in the darkest times the ability to dream up a story, even a gruesome one, can be a weapon as potent as a battleship, turning the theatre of war into a theatre of the mind where the script is written by spies and the audience is the enemy general staff. If there is a dark comedy element to Operation Mincemeat, it is most visible in the bizarre career trajectories of the German officers who were so thoroughly duped, particularly Karl Erich Kuhlenthal, the Abwehr chief in Madrid who swallowed the bait whole. In any rational organisation, a spy who feeds his superiors a piece of intelligence that is 100% wrong and leads to a catastrophic military defeat would be fired, court-martialed, or sent to the Russian front. But the Nazi intelligence apparatus was a labyrinth of incompetence and rivalry, where failure was often rewarded if it was packaged correctly. Kuhlenthal, because he had delivered such high-grade documents from the briefcase, was actually praised for his diligence, his reputation within the Abwehr momentarily soaring because he had provided the exact confirmation bias that Hitler was craving. He survived the war, living out his days with the secret knowledge, or perhaps the suppressed denial, that his greatest professional triumph was actually the moment he lost the war for his country, a walking example of the Peter principle, where he had failed upwards into disaster. On the other hand, the fate of Colonel Alexis von Rohen, the analyst in Berlin who authenticated the documents, is a much more tragic and complex tale, one that adds a layer of Shakespearean drama to the operation. Von Rohen was not a fool. He was a sharp, perceptive officer who later turned against the Nazi regime and was executed for his role in the July 20th plot to assassinate Hitler, leading many historians to speculate that his validation of the Mincemeat documents might have been an act of deliberate sabotage. Did he see the flaws in the deception? The fact that the body was too decomposed, or that a careless officer wouldn't chain a briefcase to his waist and choose to ignore them to mislead Hitler? Or was he simply overwhelmed by the volume of wallet litter and made an honest mistake? We will never know for sure, but the possibility that the British deception only worked because a German anti-Nazi traitor decided to let it work is a fascinating twist that suggests the operation succeeded not just because of British cleverness, but because of the rot at the heart of the Third Reich. The definitive proof of the operation's success didn't come until the final days of the war in 1945, when Allied troops overran the German naval archives at Tambach Castle, seizing tons of documents before they could be destroyed by the retreating Nazis. Among these papers, British intelligence officers found the smoking gun, the original German translations of the Martin documents, and the operational orders signed by General Jodl, redistributing the Panzer divisions to Greece. Reading these captured enemy files was a surreal experience for the British planners, a moment of delayed gratification where they could finally trace the exact path of their lie as it travelled from the beach in Spain to the desk of the Führer, seeing their own creative writing translated into German and treated as gospel truth. This discovery was crucial because up until that point, while they knew the invasion of Sicily had been easier than expected, they didn't have the granular details of just how completely the Germans had bought the story. The archives revealed that even weeks after the invasion began, the German High Command was still issuing orders based on the fear of a second front in Greece, paralysed by the ghost of Major Martin. The capture of the Tambach archives also revealed the close calls that could have sunk the whole ship. They found reports from other German agents in Spain who had been sceptical, pointing out inconsistencies, but these voices of reason were drowned out by the loud, confident assertions of Kuhlenthal and von Rohne. It highlights the terrifying role of luck in history, showing that if just one sceptical voice had been louder, or if one ambitious spy had been more cautious, the panzer divisions might have stayed in Sicily, and the beaches of Gela might have become a massacre for the American Seventh Army. The legacy of Mincemeat is thus a testament to the fog of war, proving that in the high-stakes poker game of global conflict, the player with the best hand doesn't always win. Sometimes, it's the player who bluffs with such total, unwavering confidence that the other side folds before the cards are even revealed. The operation effectively weaponized the German hierarchy's fear of making a mistake, creating a scenario where it was safer for a German officer to agree with the official intelligence than to question it. A psychological trap that Ewan Montague had intuitively understood and exploited to devastating effect. The success of Operation Mincemeat did something even more valuable than just unlocking the gates of Sicily. It provided the Allied High Command with a proven blueprint for the ultimate deception required for D-Day, serving as a live-fire prototype that validated the theory that you could win battles with paper and imagination rather than just blood and steel. Before Mincemeat, there was a deep, lingering skepticism among the conservative, old-school American and British generals about the true value of spy stuff, with many regarding intelligence operations as dirty, ungentlemanly tricks that were secondary to the real business of artillery and infantry. But the overwhelming success of the Major Martin ruse changed the culture of the war room forever, elevating the deception planners from eccentric oddballs to essential strategists. It paved the way for Operation Fortitude, the massive, complex web of lies designed to cover the Normandy landings in 1944, where the Allies would once again use phantom armies, fake radio traffic, and double agents to fool Hitler into thinking the invasion was coming at the Pas de Calais, instead of the beaches of Normandy. The lessons learned from the dead Welshmen were applied directly to the Ghost Army under General Patton. The planners learned that for a lie to be swallowed, it had to be incredibly detailed, it had to be consistent across multiple independent channels, and most importantly, it had to play into the enemy's existing fears, just as Mincemeat had played into Hitler's obsession with the Balkans. In fact, the psychological profiling of Adolf Hitler became a weapon in itself, as British intelligence realised that the Führer was a man who prided himself on his intuition and deeply distrusted the obvious, so they stopped trying to hide their intentions completely and instead started providing him with secret clues that pointed to the wrong conclusion, effectively hacking the mind of the dictator by feeding his own ego. The Martin documents were perfectly calibrated to make Hitler feel like he was privy to inside information that his own generals were too stupid to see, a dynamic that the Allies exploited ruthlessly for the rest of the war, turning his own paranoia into an Allied asset. There is also a fascinating road not taken aspect to this history that sends shivers down the spine of historians. Had Mincemeat failed, had the Spanish doctor performed a proper autopsy, or had the German agent Kuhlenthal been less gullible, the invasion of Sicily would likely have been a bloodbath of World War I proportions, potentially stalling the Allied advance in the Mediterranean for a year or more. This delay would have had terrifying geopolitical consequences, possibly allowing the Soviet Union to advance much further west into Europe before the war ended, changing the map of the Cold War and the Iron Curtain significantly. Thus, the homeless man didn't just save American and British lives, he effectively helped draw the borders of modern Europe, preventing a total Soviet domination of the continent by ensuring the Western Allies could keep pace in the race to Berlin. The operation also highlighted the sheer absurdity and structural weakness of the Nazi bureaucracy, where a rigid chain of command meant that once a mistake was made at the top, it was impossible to correct from the bottom. There were undoubtedly junior German analysts who looked at the Mincemeat data and smelled a rat, perhaps noting the lack of decomposition or the convenience of the find. But in a totalitarian regime, telling the boss he is wrong is often a death sentence, so the truth was suppressed by fear. This fragility of the Nazi system was the ultimate weakness that Mincemeat exposed, proving that a regime built on terror is uniquely vulnerable to deception because no one dares to be the bearer of bad news, creating an echo chamber where a lie can become the undisputed truth. The legacy of Major Martin also extends to the very specific tradecraft of legend building, the art of creating fake identities, which became a staple of Cold War espionage. The level of detail used for Martin, the receipt for the engagement ring, the overdraft notice, the angry father's letter, became the gold standard for deep cover agents on both sides of the Berlin Wall, teaching the KGB and the CIA that the devil and the salvation is always in the details. Even the humour used in the operation had lasting impact. The specific joke in the letter from General Nye about sardines being rationed was a masterstroke of realism that grounded the high-level strategy in the mundane reality of wartime shortages, a technique of verisimilitude that writers of fiction and spies alike have studied ever since. The afterlife of Major Martin in the dusty soil of Spain is a story entirely unto itself, one that developed its own mythology and rituals completely separate from the spy games in London, centering around a woman named Isabel Naylor, who became the unwitting guardian of the deception. Isabel was the daughter of a British mining engineer working in the Rio Tinto copper mines near Huelva, and as a young woman in 1943, she had watched the funeral procession of the mysterious British officer with a mixture of curiosity and patriotic sadness. After the war, when the grave was largely forgotten by the busy politicians and generals who had moved on to the Cold War, Isabel took it upon herself to ensure that William Martin was never lonely, beginning a ritual that she would perform faithfully for decades until her own death. Every week she would visit the cemetery of Nuestra Señora de la Soledad, cleaning the white marble headstone and laying fresh flowers, often red poppies on Remembrance Day, creating a localized legend that the Major was a beloved figure, despite the fact that she had no idea who he really was or the pivotal role his corpse had played in liberating Europe. Her dedication was so profound that she was eventually awarded an MBE, Member of the Order of the British Empire, by Queen Elizabeth II in 2002, a surreal recognition for tending the grave of a man who technically didn't exist. Yet her actions provided the crucial ground truth that had convinced German spies the grave was real in the first place. But while Isabel tended the flowers, a storm of controversy was brewing regarding the true identity of the body, a mystery that spawned one of the most persistent and tragic conspiracy theories of World War II, known as the HMS Dasher theory. Before the files were declassified in 1996 revealing Glyndwr Michael's name, amateur historians and sleuths had spent years trying to crack the code, and they found a coincidence that seemed too perfect to be ignored. Just weeks before the Mincemeat operation launched, a British aircraft carrier, the HMS Dasher, had mysteriously exploded and sunk in the Firth of Clyde, not far from where the submarine Seraph departed. The Dasher disaster was a massive catastrophe caused by a fuel leak, killing 379 sailors in a fireball that was so intense it was hushed up by the wartime government to prevent a collapse in morale, and for decades the families of the lost sailors were told almost nothing about how their sons died. Because the bodies from the Dasher were plentiful and located in the right place at the right time, and because they had died in the water, many researchers became convinced that Major Martin was actually a sailor named John Melville from the Dasher, whose body had been fished out and repurposed for the operation. This theory gained so much traction that it was widely accepted as fact in naval circles, offering a heroic narrative that the man who fooled Hitler was a fallen sailor serving his country, rather than a homeless suicide victim, and it was a theory that the British government did little to discourage because it was far more palatable than the grim truth about Glyndwr Michael. This led to a painful situation where the family of John Melville believed for years that their relative was the famous spy hero, only to have that belief shattered when the 1996 documents finally pointed to the Welsh drifter. However, in a touching postscript that illustrates the unique bond between the military and this operation, the Royal Navy decided to honour the Dasher theory in spirit, if not in fact. In 2004, a memorial service was held on the Dasher wreck site where the story of Operation Mincemeat was acknowledged, recognising that while Melville wasn't the body in the wetsuit, the secrecy surrounding the Dasher tragedy had inadvertently provided a smokescreen that helped protect the Mincemeat secret. The confusion over the identity highlights just how desperate the public was to assign a noble origin to the saviour of Sicily, unable to reconcile the magnitude of the victory with the humble, tragic origins of the man who achieved it. Today, the grave in Huelva remains a strange pilgrimage site, not just for history buffs but for the local Spanish population who have adopted El Major as one of their own. They tell ghost stories about the Englishman who walks the cemetery at night, unaware that the real ghost is the memory of a homeless man from Wales who travelled further in death than he ever did in life, cared for by a woman who loved a stranger, creating a web of human connection that transcends borders, wars, and even the truth itself. The story of Operation Mincemeat didn't just end in the archives, it exploded into pop culture, becoming the defining myth of British intelligence that shaped how the world perceives spies, transforming a gruesome wartime necessity into a romanticised legend of gentlemanly cunning. In 1956, the film adaptation of Montagu's book, The Man Who Never Was released, starring Clifton Webb as a sophisticated, unflappable Montague, effectively cementing the clean version of the story in the public consciousness for generations. There is a delicious meta-fictional Easter egg in that movie that most people miss. The real Ewan Montague, the man who masterminded the whole thing, actually makes a cameo appearance in the film, playing a prickly air vice marshal who criticises his own plan, a moment of surreal humour where the puppet master stepped onto the stage to critique the play he had written. However, the 1956 movie, bound by the censorship and sensibilities of the time, glossed over the darker, grittier aspects of the operation: the rotting corpse, the rat poison, the stolen identity, and instead focused on the intellectual puzzle, presenting the deception as a bloodless chess game played by men in tweed suits. It wasn't until the 2021 movie Operation Mincemeat starring Colin Firth that the story was retold for a modern audience, one that is more interested in the moral grey areas and the emotional toll of lying for a living. This modern retelling brought the character of Jean Leslie, the fiancée Pam, out of the shadows and into the spotlight, highlighting the surreal experience of a 19-year-old MI5 secretary whose casual snapshot became the most studied photograph in the Third Reich. Jean Leslie's role is one of the most fascinating human elements of the saga. She was a young woman looking for excitement in a war-torn city, and she handed over a photo of herself in a bathing suit, taken on a holiday before the war, never dreaming that it would end up on the desk of Wilhelm Canaris, the head of German intelligence, or that lonely German officers in Madrid would gaze at it with longing, projecting their own desires onto a ghost's girlfriend. She became, in a strange, twisted way, the pin-up girl of the Abwehr, her image used to sell a lie that would kill thousands of their own soldiers. The relationship between Montague and Leslie, which hovered on the edge of romance during the operation, adds a layer of poignant tragedy to the deception. They were two people pretending to be in love through the medium of a dead man, channeling their own loneliness and fear into the letters of Bill and Pam, creating a fictional relationship that felt more real than many actual wartime marriages. When the war ended, the fantasy dissolved. Montague's wife returned from America, John Leslie moved on, and the romance was filed away in a cardboard box, leaving behind only the letters as evidence of a love affair that never technically existed. These letters, now preserved in the National Archives, are a testament to the power of creative writing. They are filled with mundane details about wedding dresses, nagging parents, and the price of rings, details that are utterly boring and yet utterly convincing because they capture the texture of everyday life. This is the ultimate lesson of mincemeat that writers and spies alike have studied ever since. You don't fool people with grand dramatic lies. You fool them with the small, boring truths, the wallet litter of existence that no one would bother to fake. The operation also marks the end of an era, the high-water mark of analogue espionage. Because in today's world of digital surveillance, DNA databases and facial recognition, Operation Mincemeat would be impossible to pull off. A modern intelligence agency would identify the body in seconds, trace the photo to a social media profile, and debunk the cover story before the briefcase was even opened. Therefore, the story of the Major stands as a monument to a lost time when the world was still big enough to hide a man, when a single eyelash could change the course of history, and when the fate of nations could hang on the credibility of a handwritten love letter, creating a nostalgia for a type of warfare that was, for all its grimness, undeniably human in its execution. The Man Who Never Was has thus become a symbol of the good war mythology, a reminder of a time when the British could outwit the Nazis with nothing more than a sense of humour, a corpse, and a very good story, proving that in the end the pen, or at least the typewriter, really was mightier than the sword. After the adrenaline of the war faded and the ticker-tape parades ended, the architects of Operation Mincemeat had to return to a grey, drab reality, stepping out of the shadows of the Admiralty basement and back into civilian clothes, a transition that was jarring for men who had spent years playing God with history. Ewan Montague, the smooth-talking lawyer who had lived a double life as the master spy, returned to the legal profession, eventually rising to the prestigious position of Judge Advocate of the Fleet, where he presided over legal matters for the Navy with the same sharp, dissecting intellect he had used to fool the Nazis. For him, the operation became the defining moment of his life, a golden anecdote that opened doors and eventually led to his literary fame. But beneath the polished exterior of the successful author, he remained deeply protective of the operation's darker secrets, acting as the fierce gatekeeper of the narrative until his death in 1985, ensuring that the official version remained the only version for as long as possible. In stark contrast, Charles Cholmondeley, the gangly, eccentric visionary who had first conceived the idea of the corpse, drifted away from the limelight, embodying the tragic archetype of the genius who is better with ideas than with people, the cue to Montague's Bond. He continued to serve in the security services for a while, hunting for spies in the post-war rubble, and later seemingly selling agricultural equipment. But he never sought the fame that Montague achieved. He married, settled into a quiet, almost reclusive life in the country, and died in 1982. Largely unknown to the public that owed him so much, a man who was happy to let the Major take the credit while he stayed in the background, perhaps haunted by the gruesome mechanics of the plan he had birthed. Then there was Lieutenant Bill Jewell, the submarine commander who had recited the psalm over the body. He continued to have a legendary naval career, later participating in dangerous missions to smuggle agents into occupied France and dropping paratroopers for the D-Day invasion, effectively serving as the bookend to the European liberation. But he always spoke of the mincemeat drop as the most nerve-wracking moment of his life, a haunting memory of sliding a dead man into the dark Atlantic that stayed with him long after the torpedoes stopped firing. The operation also left a permanent mark on the institutional DNA of British intelligence, transforming the 20 Committee from a wartime improvisation into a model for future deception agencies. The lesson that truth is the best bodyguard for a lie became a doctrine that would be used throughout the Cold War, influencing how the West handled defectors, double agents, and disinformation campaigns against the Soviet Union. The files on mincemeat became required reading for new recruits at MI5 and the CIA, a textbook case study in lateral thinking that taught young spies that the most effective weapon isn't a gun or a bomb, but a story that the enemy wants to believe. This psychological aspect is perhaps the most enduring legacy of the operation. It proved that you can hack a human mind just as easily as you can crack a code, provided you understand the target's prejudices and desires. Hitler wanted to believe the Allies were afraid of his strength in Sicily, so he believed the lie that confirmed his own arrogance, a terrifying lesson about confirmation bias that resonates even more today in our era of fake news and algorithmic echo chambers, where people are constantly fed information that reinforces what they already think, making the principles of Operation Mincemeat more relevant in the 21st century than they were in 1943. As we look back at the scattered team, the lawyer, the eccentric, the secretary and the submariner, We see a snapshot of a unique moment in history where amateurs could outsmart professionals, where a small group of people in a basement could outmaneuver a totalitarian state, proving that in the end, wars are won by people, not just machines. But as the sun sets on the generation that fought the war, the moral complexity of what they did remains. They used a man who had no voice to save the voices of the free world, a utilitarian trade-off that sits uncomfortably in the modern stomach, reminding us that the good war was often won with very dirty hands. The final chapter of this saga isn't just about the victory parade. It's about the silence that followed, the secrets kept in locked drawers, and the lonely grave in Spain that stood as a mute witness to the greatest trick ever played, waiting for the world to finally understand the full cost of the deception. The story of Glyndwr Michael and William Martin is a dual biography of the 20th century, a mirror holding the image of a forgotten pauper against the image of a celebrated hero, asking us to decide which one is the true face of war. In the grand, chaotic tapestry of World War II, filled with the roar of atomic bombs and the clash of massive tank armies, Operation Mincemeat stands out as a quiet, singular testament to the power of the human mind over the machine of war. A reminder that history doesn't just turn on the decisions of great men in palaces, but sometimes on the tragic fate of a lonely drifter in a cold London warehouse. Glyndwr Michael, a man who lived without hope and died in despair, a man who was utterly failed by the system during his lifetime, was given a second life that was more purposeful and heroic than anyone could have imagined, transforming from a victim of society into its silent, anonymous saviour. If you were to visit Huelva today, you would find the grave to be a peaceful place. The sound of the Atlantic waves, the same waves that carried him ashore, providing a constant rhythm to his eternal rest. But the silence there is heavy with the weight of thousands of American, British and Canadian soldiers who came home to their families, who had children and grandchildren, solely because a dead man took their place on the casualty list of Sicily. This operation changed the very nature of espionage, proving that the greatest weapon isn't always a gun or a code-breaking machine, but an idea, a narrative so compelling that even a paranoid dictator like Hitler couldn't resist it, effectively hacking the enemy's mind by feeding them the story they desperately wanted to hear. It forces us to look at the invisible people in our own world, the homeless and the forgotten, and realise that every single human life holds potential, even if, in Glyndwr's specific and tragic case, that potential was only realised after the end, raising uncomfortable ethical questions that we still struggle to answer today. Was it a desecration of the dead, or was it the ultimate act of pragmatism in a war for survival? We often talk about the unknown soldier as a symbol of collective sacrifice, but Glyndwr Michael is the unknown hero, the man who fooled the Third Reich with nothing but a trench coat, a pocket full of fake love letters, and a very good backstory, proving that in the theatre of war, the person who controls the script controls the outcome. As we close the top-secret file on Major William Martin, we are left with a story that is equal parts spy thriller, Greek tragedy, and dark comedy. A story that proves that truth really is stranger than fiction, and that sometimes the dead have more power than the living, casting long shadows that change the shape of the future. So the next time you look at a map of Europe or read a history book about the liberation of Italy, remember that behind the grand arrows on the maps and the sterile dates of the battles, there are stories like this one, strange, uncomfortable, and deeply human, waiting to be told, stories of how the world was saved not by a Superman, but by a man who never was. Thanks for watching this deep dive into one of history's wildest deceptions. If you enjoyed unravelling this mystery with me, and want to see more stories about the hidden side of history, make sure to hit that like button, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next episode, and let me know in the comments below. Do you think using Glyndwr Michael's body was a stroke of genius or a moral failure? I'll catch you guys in the next video. Stay curious,